everyone, I'm Philip, and thanks for coming to today's mastering workshop. I am going to record this, and then I'm going to dump this over to YouTube, and I'll put the link up to the YouTube recording on Discord, so if you want to check it out later. I also have my slides up, because I'm sure these slides are not going to be visible. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about mastering. What do people think mastering is? How many of you have heard of mastering? All right. Oh, everyone's heard of mastering. So all of you probably have opinions about what mastering is. What is mastering? I think a lot of no opinions. Yeah.
I think what I've heard.
Oh yeah. Sorry. Okay. All right.
Whatever. I just heard that it's sort of like what the description for the event was.
Yeah.
It's just like making it sound good across like a variety of different mediums, not
Yeah.
just like whatever you originally mixed it in.
Right. So it's like make it sound good on like different earbuds, on like big speakers, on the car radio, whatever it is. Yep.
More than just slapping a limiter on it and making sure it's not like minus 0.3 dB.
Yeah, but there is that too. It's like that is part of the job. That's absolutely and more. It's that plus more, right? It's like making sure that it fits within certain criteria, certain industry criteria. That some of which are technologically bound, and some of them are more like conventions that have been established by industry. So there's a couple of things that the word mastering has been used in the music industry to mean a couple of different things during its history. Originally, it was quite simply preparing music for distribution, and that usually meant cutting a lacquer, which is making the very, very first grooved version of the music, right? Like you're recording in the studio, you're recording it onto tape. At some point of time, you've got to prepare that tape for mass production, for mass replication on vinyl, because that's how you're going to be able to manufacture many copies of the same song at speed by stamping them onto PVC. So mastering used to be the process of producing that very first vinyl master, and it was called a lacquer. It's actually usually some sort of metal disc that aluminum, if I recall, coated with a layer of actual lacquer. It's just like organic material. It gets soft when it's hot. You drop a ruby cutter on top of it with a bunch of really powerful electromagnets that make it vibrate when you actually play the stereo tracks through it. They cut a groove, and then from there they make they metallize it. They make like a negative of that, and then depending on how big an artist you are, they may make another like positive clone and then another negative to make a lot of different stampers. And then all of those stampers go into an individual PVC pressing machine, and out comes out vinyl records. That's what mastering originally was. Obviously, that's not all mastering is today, because now there's many, even in the days of CD, even in the days of cassette tape replication, there was already like more than one way to be able to mass distribute your music. But that's why this version of mastering actually comes into play, because if you realize if you're going to have to record this whole thing onto one disc at a time, whether it's a plastic CD or a PVC record, you have to do that all in one shot. On CD, it'll be all in one burn. You have to do that whole thing in one single session. You can't actually record individual tracks, because what happens is that if you just record one track at a time, you get gaps between each song. And those gaps are very hard to control. But if you record that whole thing at once, you can have a gapless recording. You can have transitions that go smoothly from one song to the other without any silence at all. You can control how long those gaps exactly are. And of course, you can do that on vinyl as well. So mastering also includes assembling different tracks that are going to go into that same compilation or album or EP, and making sure that they all work together. So all the volumes make sense. If you've got like a quiet ballad followed by like a really big explosive arena or rock song or something, those tracks have got to sound like they actually belong on the same release. Maybe that means that the vocal levels are about the same between the two sounds. One of them, the guitars are incredibly huge and the drums are incredibly huge. The other one has like a single acoustic guitar, but the vocals are the same between the two of them, right? So people don't end up having to like get off their couch, change the volume between tracks. One doesn't sound like it's all muffled and someone singing in a tin can, and the other one sounds like it was recorded live in the stadium, right? You don't want to have those two things happen on the same album. So if you want to generalize that, because nowadays people don't generally listen to whole albums at a time. People listen to playlists and shuffle. Those are the kinds of that's just the habit of today. We've got to make sure that tracks that get released today, no matter where they are in an album, whether they were released as singles or they're like track 5 on the album, we expect that they're going to be like played on a playlist or on shuffle at some point in time. But we've got to make sure that the tracks sort of stand well all by themselves and stand well in the mix of what's currently being released out there, at least within the same genre. And also, there's like, if you've ever heard of remastering, if you've got an old recording, if you've got, a live stage recording, for instance, and it's not perfect, going back in and fixing it, or maybe there is a studio recording that's been damaged in some way or another, it's like really, really old or something, going in and fixing that, that's also mastering. That's usually referred to as remastering. But today I'm just really going to talk about two things. Mostly, I'm going to be talking about just making one single track sound good so that it works with other tracks when it's being played with other tracks on each level. But really, this is the end goal. It's preparing that track so that it's ready for release as a single. And of course, that could be a second stage, which is, well, this is what you do with one track, then you do it with another track, then you do it with another track, and then you assemble it to an album. I won't be covering that today. That's way too much. So the first rule of mastering is simply do no harm. Also, I believe this came from medical practice. But for those of you who are interested in mastering tracks, especially mastering tracks for someone else, the whole point is not to actually put your stamp on it. That's not the job of the mastering engineer, is not to change that thing into something that's your work. You want to honor the artist's intention, all the effort they put into recording and mixing and arranging and composing all that music, and their vision. So for instance, I'm going to have a couple of tracks today to demonstrate, but some of the songs came from artists, some of whom are in this room, and they have a specific intention when they made their composition, and I need to sort of understand what were they going for before I can make any changes that they're going to be happy with, because the other ones are going to have to live with the stuff that I make. Having respect for the artist sometimes means admitting that you're not the right person for the job. If somebody wants me to make a super loud, extremely compressed, crushed club track or something like that, I'm probably the wrong person for the job, because I personally am a DJ, and those are tracks that I don't play. So I don't actually know what a good version of that music sounds like. Someone else might have a better opinion, a different mastering engineer will have a different opinion. So pointing people towards the right direction to go might actually be just as respectful as trying to do right by the artist. So just to be clear, mastering is a creative process, but for the most part, you're providing a service. So to prepare to start mastering, there's a bunch of things that I actually did before you all came in. First of all, I calibrated these speakers and I positioned them and I made sure that all the levels are correct. First of all, the left and right speakers, I verified that they're the same volume level. And I calibrated them so that it sounds just loud enough when I'm playing music at its full volume, right? The standard that I work to is called K14 or K-14, which is the idea is that if 0 is the maximum volume that, if I play a pure sine wave through from a CD that just goes from peak to peak, and I play that, that's of course way too loud. That's not where I want music to be. But that's the loudest of which my system can handle. I want to be working 14 decibels below that. That's my personal standard. Other people work to different standards, but typically, I believe broadcast uses -23. So broadcast and film and TV, they tend to work at these like round about 23 decibels of what's known as headroom. So you have, but my average loudness for what I do is about -14 decibels. There's room treatment or acoustic correction, which I obviously can't do in this room. So I have to live with this box of a room, and you're going to have to listen to it. But if I was working at home, I mean, right now I'm in the process of getting a new bookcase just to be able to deal with some of the reflections that I get in my living room, which is where I work. And that is just to be able to control some of, I have a particular bass resonance at 110 hertz or something that I want to deal with. I know if I stick a bookshelf, then I'll break it up. And then I'll have another problem to solve, but at least I'll deal with that problem. That might include doing things like dealing with reflections, where you see sometimes some studios they've got like foam all around, but that's usually less essential than dealing with bass. And bass doesn't require bumpy foam. Bass requires angles for the most part. It requires angles and gaps of air. So you've got like dense, almost like insulation that you use for your house, usually wrapped up in a wooden frame so that it doesn't just flop all over the place, piped up against the corner of your wall so that you don't have a sharp 90-degree corner, you have angles. And that sort of like breaks up bass resonances in the room. But those are the hardest ones to usually deal with and take the most effort. So a lot of studios, they put all their effort in that first. And then yeah, you can do other things like the low foam things, but that's not an issue for mastering. It's probably more of an issue for recording, frankly. But I'm not recording anything, I'm just mastering. Headphones can be used. Think of headphones as the microscope that I'm using to sort of like analyze when there's like a specific problem and I really, really need to like focus down on it. It's important to get headphones that make bad stuff sound bad. You don't want headphones that sound good with everything. So then a lot of consumer headphones are designed to make everything kind of sound pretty good. That's not what you want. You want mediocre recorded material to sound mediocre. Right now I'm using Sennheiser HD 280s. One day I will upgrade to HD 650s, but they're way too expensive. I can't afford them right now. But those are pretty flat. But even with like headphones that are not entirely neutral, I can still work with them for mastering because I'll be referencing other music that I know has been professionally recorded, that I know that's already sound good. And if I can sort of match that sound on my headphones or on my speakers, then it's okay. It's like I'm sort of compensating for any deficiencies in my equipment with my hearing part of my brain. However, another way I can sort of like make things a little bit easier for me is just switch between different speakers. Right now, I only have these two out here. But back home, I've got a really dinky Dell speaker that's attached to my monitors. I've got a similar pair of headphones of speakers at home. And I've got my home hi-fi system, which I do all my like enjoyable listening to when I'm sitting back on my couch. And they're all connected to my computer, so I just like drop a menu and I select them. And I can take that same audio and I can pipe it into any one of these three. And that way, and my headphones too. So I can sort of, if I'm not entirely sure, I just switch. And I listen to it to a different set of speakers. And just being able to easily switch from one to the other is a big asset. I'll have some more tips on that right at the end. And you really got to get familiar with any speakers. These are my personal speakers. You've got to listen to all kinds of music on it, because you've got to know what well-recorded music sounds like on your particular system. If you're constantly changing it around, then you're never really going to know your system. Maybe less of an issue if you're mixing and recording. It is absolutely essential for mastering. It's like you've got to know what professionally released stuff sounds like in order to make professionally released stuff sound like that, right? By the way, if you go to the NPC Discord, the In the Studio channel currently has 15 trial license codes for this thing called SonarWorks, which is what I'm using. And it's basically frequency correction. So if you can't, like in my case, my headphones are not perfect. It will actually correct any frequency discrepancies in my headphones based on a very, very large library of what the manufacturer set up, basically. And you can, if you download the trial license code, they'll work until the end of December. So you can give it a shot. I also use I actually use the version of that. I'm using it today for the speakers, but the trial license codes are only for headphones. Okay, so what are the tools for mastering? Well, there's really three groups. There's stuff that's looking at the frequency spectrum. So the equalizers will let you sort of make changes to the frequency spectrum. And then we got spectrum analyzers and spectrograms to show us what we're changing. So they sort of visualize these are the things that are happening in the frequency domain. What's happening in the bass, what's happening in the high frequencies, in the treble, what's happening around the singer's voice or around the guitar. There's mid-size processors and balancers. Those are really more for sort of like working with the stereo image. Does it sound like the drums are here and the bass is there and the keyboard's over there? Or does it sound like they're all standing in a row and they're somehow all merged into a single amorphous blob in the middle? Do they sound like they're standing in front of each other, or do they sound like they're all like crushed up against each other in some sort of weird band in a telephone booth? And to be able to analyze that, there are goniometers and correlation meters, and I'll show you examples of those. These are just the names of the tools that you'll be seeing when I do a demonstration. Then there's all the tools that are used to control how loud, how amplified something is. So starting with the most basic gain, is just by what percentage am I amplifying this or reducing? And that's in every single digital audio workstation out there. They all have different ways of achieving the same thing, but there's always some sort of utility gain control. Compressors, on the other hand, are a little bit more conditional on time and volume. So it's like a compressor will say take your audio signal, and only when it passes a certain threshold of volume will it turn on. And when it turns on, it reduces the gain, so that all the volume beyond that point gets reduced. And then when your music becomes quiet again, it stops that reduction. So technically, it's reducing the loud parts of your music. In practice, it's actually bringing up the quiet parts of your music, because every single compressor has this thing called makeup gain, which is this now that you've reduced how loud your music is, you can bring the whole thing up. So now the quiet things are louder and the loud parts stay about the same. That's largely what compressors are used for. A saturator is basically the same thing, only it's trying to emulate what would happen if you try to accomplish the same goal by driving it through analog circuitry or some sort of like analog tape. But you get a kind of compression, but you also can get kinds of like harmonics and clipping that will come out. But usually a fairly pleasant sounding clipping. If you've ever listened to a cassette tape that was recorded too loud, you might actually be familiar with the sound. And if you're making some sort of like vintage style or genre of recording, it might be exactly what you're looking for. It's kind of like overdriven. And in fact, I have a track here from an NDC member which was specifically going for this effect. He told me, I wanted to sound like 60s Motown. And they had that tape saturation. A limiter is just a very aggressive compressor. Compressors, usually you define them by their ratio of reduction. So like past the threshold, if the sound goes up by 1 decibel, I only want to go up by 1/4 of a decibel. Then that's a 1:4 ratio compressor. A limiter is more like a 1:10 ratio. So if it goes up by 1 decibel, only let it get up by 0.1 decibel. You can actually have even more aggressive limiters than that, but you can imagine it starts to sound pretty problematic. Limiters are more of a seatbelt. It's like a protection device to make sure that you're not exceeding any industry standards. You're not exceeding the capacity of of the audio playback hardware, and to make sure that you're within those limitations. And in some cases, like a compressor, people do use limiters to be able to make stuff louder, sometimes too loud, to the point where you can actually hear the effects of the limiter and it sounds bad. But it has happened. And clippers are the most aggressive, which is just, well, if it's just past this point, just cut it. Some people like that sound and use it in a creative way in the studio. That's not what I'm talking about today. But there are times where there are some mastering engineers will actually want to use that to achieve a certain loudness level. And they want to do it in a pleasing way. So there's actually clippers that will sort of combine a little bit of compression, a bit of saturation, a bit of limiting, and make that clipping sound not as bad as just a hard digital chop off the top. And of course, there are meters to be able to analyze all of that. Of course, there are some tools that actually do more than one of these categories at a time. Base mono is basically saying, well, below this frequency, make it mono. And that's extremely important for things like cutting vinyl, because vinyl does a very, very bad job of being able to properly read stereo bass sounds. It's like stereo bass can make the needle jump out, and as a result of that, you get a skip or you get a bad cutting. And so having mono bass is important because a lot of people can't tell the difference on whether the bass is coming from the left and the right anyway. So if you actually mono that bass out, you can actually you can actually make vinyl cuts sound better. Actually, it does have some advantages if you're going to like compress that music over to MP3 or AAC, but that's less audible. But for the most part, it's a good idea because stereo bass doesn't usually work unless your original recording was in stereo. Unless you were originally recording a real bass instrument in stereo, it's actually really, really hard to make stereo bass actually work on a recording. Mid-side EQ, if I'm going to be equalizing, say, there's a guitar and it's it's somewhere near the center of the of where I want the left and right of the stereo spread to be. But then it has this long echoey reverb that kind of envelops you, right? It seems to go on forever. Well, maybe that guitar is too loud in the mix, but maybe I can just reduce that guitar but keep that reverb, and it still sounds huge. It still gives you that, I don't know, vast U2 sound or something like that, without necessarily being like the loudest instrument on the track. That's where mid-side EQ comes in handy, because like if I bring down the frequencies of the guitar in the mid while keeping the sides untouched, or vice versa. Dynamic EQ is basically what happens if an EQ and a compressor had a baby. And it's just past this certain volume level in this frequency. If it gets too loud, turn down this frequency. Or if it gets dropped below a certain point, you can bring it up. That's called expanding. But that's what dynamic EQ is. And in fact, a de-esser, how many of you have heard of de-essers? Okay, so a de-esser is the whole point. What does a de-esser do? It's in the name.
Removes acid.
What?
Removes acid.
It removes that sound, that sibilant sound, the S sound, right? Yeah, it's a de-esser. It takes away, so if somebody's singing and you've got a recording, and there's a lot of, it's like she sells seashells on the seashore, and it sounds really, really harsh and sibilant. A de-esser is basically a dynamic EQ that's tuned to that frequency of the human voice going and that's all it is really. And multi-band compression is another child of EQ and compressor, where it's like instead of just compressing the whole audio signal, let's compress the bass separately from the mids, separately from the treble. Usually you've got like 3 to 5 bands of splitting it up. But let's treat all of these different frequency bands as its own sound, and then compress them separately, which is very, very popular for tracks that really want to be loud, but also for genres where like volume is an asset. So hip hop definitely in like especially 90s to 2000 era hip hop use a lot of off-band compression. I don't know actually how popular it is in like trap. It's definitely popular in EDM. So I couldn't see it. All right. What are the plugins you could use? Well, really, like you only need like 4 of these. So there's way too many options out there. I will again have this entire thing pasted up on the NPC Discord later, so you can take a look at it. I want to point out that both Ableton and Logic Pro have stock processors that do a fine job, except for maybe Ableton's limiter. Ableton's limiter sucks. It's terrible. But there's a use for it. And I'll show you what you can do with stock Ableton plugin shortly. Logic Pro has way more options. And that's partly because Apple actually has like a whole bunch of different things built into their core audio system, which you might already have installed in your computer if you're using a Mac and you didn't know that you have them installed. They got a multi-band compressor in there, a peak limiter, and a multi-band EQ, and a dynamics processor with basically a compressor. So there's a lot of different tools that are already built into computers. But of course, there are both free and paid third-party plugins that you can download and install. So Waves F6 is a 6-band EQ, not 6-band. It's a 6-pole EQ. C1's a compressor. S1 is a stereo spread. But a lot of these companies that sell multiple mastering tools also have bundles where you can get the same tools for a lower cumulative cost. And that's kind of what I've done. I've got these two, Waves and FabFilter, and they're both really, really good for achieving different results.
Just want to give a shout out to 2 other plugins I think are pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
One is like, it's super common, Waves L2.
Mm-hmm.
It's like,
I didn't include it because it's in here. It's in the Grandmasters. Yeah.
yeah, it's like $30, pretty good. Another one that I like is called Invisible Limiter.
I
I've
remember
used that
that.
one a couple of times.
Yeah.
And it's like, it reduces the peaks, but it's invisible. I don't know how it works, but it just does that.
Yeah, the Waves L2 might be the reason why the loudness will happen at all, because it was like one of those very effective limiters at allowing you to make stuff super loud without exceeding the threshold that was set by the industry. We'll see the L2 in action shortly. I want to point out that there's actually a couple of plugins like T-Rex and Ozone, where it's like, it looks like it's one plugin, but it's actually inside that plugin, there's like a bunch of little baby plugins. And each one of those things kind of does all of these different components. So Ozone is, for instance, think of it as it's a package that appears to your DAW as a single plugin. The bottom are all the clippers. I don't use plugins, so I really don't know how well they work. Yeah, Logic Pro has tape delay and fan effects. Tape delay can be used for saturation, but it was never really designed for that, so I don't know how well it works.
What's AU round trip AAC from Apple?
Yeah. So these are audio units, Apple audio units. You may already have them on your computer and not realize that they're already there. But they will appear as, they will have those names if you load up your DAW. If you don't have them installed, they're probably available from Apple for free, because they're really designed for people who need audio processing in their software development. But they work pretty darn well. I'll show you some.
And what's the round trip specifically?
For round trip AAC, it allows you to hear what your music's going to sound like if it's compressed with the AAC encode. So it's part of the process if you're going to master something for iTunes. It's like you to hear your own music being encoded by the iTunes compressor. And that's data compression, not volume compression. Just to be clear, that's a completely. But I want to stress, you really only need like 4 or 5 processors. I have bought way too many plugins to justify the cost that I spent on them, because I don't need all of them. More important is that you get plugins that work for your workflow. So one of the tips that I'm going to give out, don't buy any plugin until you've tried the demo. Download the free demo. There's always a free demo. Download that. Try it first. See if it works for your workflow before you spend any money. especially with Black Friday coming up, it's going to be so tempting to spend money. Don't. Try the demo first, then spend your money. And a lot of them are free. Now, metering, on the other hand, you can actually use quite a few different metering plugins simultaneously because each meter kind of gives you a different insight on the same problem. RMS meters can vary by quite a bit, but spectrum analyzers vary by a whole bunch. It's like they will analyze the same song, the same audio signal that you're passing it, and give you a completely different visual. So, and you might be thinking, well, which one is right? And it's like, none of them are right. They're all wrong. But if you're comparing your song against some professionally released song on the same meter, you're going to see something that's useful because you're comparing apples to apples in a situation. If you're switching between different spectrum analyzers, it's not useful to compare the result from two different spectrum analyzers, but it's useful to compare two different songs on the same spectrum analyzer. And of course, you could have multiple spectrum analyzers. The only problem with analyzers is that sometimes they can be a bit processor intensive. Isotope Insight in particular is ridiculously processor intensive. I don't understand why. But you'll again see some of these in action. So I do want to point out one thing: loudness penalty. It exists in a plugin, but also as a free website. So that's a website where you can just send in an audio file, and it will tell you uploaded. You know, if you uploaded this song to Spotify or Apple Music or SoundCloud or Tidal, how much is it going to be turned down by? How much is YouTube going to like change the volume of your music once it's been uploaded to your site? And it will give you a really good estimate. So you'll sort of get a sense. Okay, that's what's going to happen once it's uploaded. For repairing, Isotope RX8. Right. RX9 is coming out, but Isotope RX is again one of those like here's this piece of software that actually does like 20 different things. You can see some of those things on the right side. It's the only thing that I found recently that actually does the work for me. I will probably end up keeping the recording of today's session using Isotope RX. It's the industry standard. It is pretty expensive, but they have a cheap version called RX Elements, which is like what, $50, something like that. It's not that much. But if you need to repair a recording, you've got a vocal, but your singer just keeps smacking their lips, for instance, and you've got to get that lip smack out of there. RX has a tool. It's kind of scary. But I wouldn't go into detail about how that works. I do want to talk about loudness, though. No, I do want to talk about loudness. This is important. So, people understand what RMS is, root mean square. Okay, because this is MIT, folks might be already familiar with that. So, before the digital world came along, and even while CDs were out and people were making CDs, root mean square was kind of the state of the art for how do we gauge that something is loud enough. But if you just measure the waveform and you just see voltages, it doesn't actually tell you anything about how that sound is going to sound like. Originally, using analog hardware to measure loudness started with peak program meters, which is basically just showing what the loudest voltage, what the higher voltage level was in the past 4 milliseconds. And that was actually totally useless for gauging how loud something sounded. Then the volume unit, as some of you may have heard of VU meters, integrated that information about 300 milliseconds by basically just having a needle that moved slower. Same hardware, needle that just was heavier and moved slower over about 300 milliseconds. And that was useful for a while until they could actually build circuitry to just give you a proper RMS value over 300 seconds. And that's pretty good. I do want to say that there's this thing called the K system, which is basically just using RMS meters, but they calibrated 3 decibels higher, so that if you actually fed it a full volume sine wave, it will actually max out the meter. Because that's the loudest that your system can possibly reproduce sound anyway, so it should max out the meter. So if you ever see RMS plus 3 dB, that's what it's trying to do. It's trying to like fit this thing called the K system. The K system is named after Bob Katz, who literally wrote the book on mastering. So you all can check this out later. But with digital, we have this thing called DBFS, which is decibels to full scale. And digital full scale is basically the maximum, the very lowest bit value to the very highest bit value, and that an audio signal can possibly have in given some bit depth. So if it's like 16 bits, what does 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 to 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, what is that scale? That's full scale. That's the maximum difference that you can have in signal. And typically, when you're using DBFS and you're talking about how loud something is, it's always a negative number. Because you can't exceed the theoretical upper and lower bounds of a digital signal, right? It's an integer. It could be a floating point, but in general, it's this number that fits in a very, very specific band of possible numerical values. So everything is usually expressed in a negative number. Something that's minus 1 dBFS is very loud, because only 1 dB less than the theoretical maximum. Something that's minus 14 dBFS is much quieter and more typical of pop music movies. However, there's this thing called true peak. If you look at this, if you think of each of these red dots over here as a sample, and say those 2 dots right there on top, say that's 0 dBFS, right there at the maximum, okay? As loud as you can possibly get. When you convert this back into analog, it could exceed 0 dBFS. Because in order to be able to reconstruct that analog wave through your analog circuitry, the thing that's actually pumping out of your speakers, it can go through those 2 dots perfectly fine, and as a result of that, create a sound that's actually larger than any sound that's numerically encoded in a digital signal. So there's this thing called true peak, which could be plus something dBFS. At which point you are like straight out danger zone. You are making sounds that some consumer hardware is going to have trouble actually reproducing, and definitely violate some broadcast specs. Definitely violate some film specs, and really most streaming platforms are not going to like what you send them. It's going to sound terrible when you send it to but it was under those conditions where the loudness war happened. Are people familiar with this loudness war? All right. So, in my opinion, it actually happened. The conditions were set in the analog era, but it really, really took off in the digital era. Because in the analog era, what do we have to work with? Cassettes and vinyl, right? Those are kind of like the 2 big releases. Both of them have physical limitations on how loud you can sort of encode a signal in them before the signal just breaks up. Some people will call that pleasant saturation, but at some point in time, you turn it too high and it becomes unpleasant saturation. Vinyl, if you have the signal that's too hot, you could actually ruin the machine that's cutting your vinyl. And no recording studio or vinyl master engineer is going to allow that to happen. So you have a limit on how hot you can have a signal with vinyl. But when it came to digital, now you know where the limits are. The challenge is how loud can I encode an audio signal into this thing while meeting the numerical fixed digital limits. And here's an example of Michael Jackson's Black or White track from the original album and through 2 compilation releases. You can see in the early version, none of the peaks actually hit the theoretical maximum. There's a little gap between the theoretical maximum and the very, very highest peak. And in the second version, that's not happening, but you can see they're already kind of being evened out. They're kind of like being mastered so that they're getting as close as possible. And you can also notice that the waveform is just denser. It's basically they're trying to use as much of that digital information to be able to convey a larger average waveform. And it gets kind of out of hand right here at the bottom. And listeners, some group of listeners with nice sound systems start to notice and start to realize this is not actually doing the sound any benefit. Sure, it makes it louder on first playback, but they're still going to adjust the volume so that it sounds pleasing to, a voice sounds like at the right level that you want to hear that particular voice in. And then probably what's going to happen is that you're just actually going to have that signal shrunk, and you actually have a piece of music that actually has less information. And you can hear that loss of information in clipping, in compression, in limiting. So here's a visualization from 1985 to about 2010 or so. These are not specifically in numerical order, but these are ratings given by consumers. The DR number is just a user rating, but that user rating correlates to the actual dynamic range, the difference between what the average root mean square measurement of the loudest part of the song, like the chorus, for instance, or the guitar solo, the RMS reading and the peak. And you can see it gets like smaller and smaller and smaller until we get the infamous Metallica Death Magnetic album, where the drums don't even really sound like drums anymore. They just sound like rumbles in the background because there's no space left. There's no white space left for drum hits to actually live anymore. So it just ends up looking like this throughout the entire song. So that was a problem, but there really didn't seem to be anything to stop it because there was this prevailing wisdom that louder songs would get more audiences' attention. But then advertisers really pushed the limit on how loud you could make something, and that actually made Congress of it. Not just in America, but in other regulatory boards all over the world, basically saying advertising has gotten too loud. We need a way to be able to measure loudness so that if something was too loud, we can turn it down, and RMS isn't cutting it. So that's where this thing called EBU R128 comes in, and this is a standard from, I think that's the European Broadcasting Union. I'm not sure if that's right. But they basically came up with this thing called a loudness unit, or LUFS, and it takes into account that our ears don't hear all frequencies the same way. We're pretty bad at hearing bass. We tend to feel bass more than we actually hear it. We're pretty good, particularly good at hearing the frequencies for the human voices. And we kind of have a peak at the very highest frequencies, although we tend to lose that as we get older. So what they did, if you take these curves, which are basically measurements of people's hearing, at different volume levels, and you flip it upside down, and then you sort of simplify that graph a little bit, you come up with this thing called a K-weight filter, which is basically a way of taking an RMS signal, and then if it's a very bassy signal, you reduce that count. If it's a very high-pitched signal, you increase that weighting. You come up with a new score. It's not exactly human hearing, but it's close. It's a fairly simple electrical or digital algorithm, and it actually does a pretty good job of analyzing. This is what someone is actually going to think this piece of music sounds like based on the numerical analysis of this sound wave. And as a result of that, we have this thing called LUFS, loudness units to full scale. I already explained what full scale is. And so loudness units to full scale is usually, again, a negative number, because zero is the maximum that your music could possibly encode. Then something below that is where your music actually lives. And they actually have three different standards. They're integrated, which is the whole track. How loud is the average LU loudness unit for the whole track? And then there's short term over 3 seconds, and there's a momentary, which is the 400 milliseconds, which is closer to like seeing that needle jump up and down. So I'm gonna skip through some of the details, but I do want to talk about this particular measurement, which is the true peak. We already talked about that, compared to the LUFS short term. So if this is your peak, say up here, this is say your measured LUFS over the past 3 seconds. We get this thing in between called PSR. And PSR is actually a really, really good way of describing how dynamic does your recording sound, how dynamic does your mix sound. Anything less than PSR8, in my opinion, actually sounds audibly crushed. Like you've clearly lost something. You're clearly manipulating the sound to make things that are loud more compressed in order to make everything else louder. Anything higher than that tends to be quite invisible. And the LUFS standard is particularly important because now that it exists, and because it's a published, documented algorithm on how to actually analyze music, you notice that a whole bunch of different streaming platforms, including the biggest ones, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, maybe Amazon's a bit fuzzier, but a lot of them are sort of like converging between 13 to 16 LUFS. It's like if your song is louder than 14 LUFS, basically, it's going to turn it down. You know, if you upload something to YouTube and it's super loud, it's going to turn it down. So all of that loudness that you try to achieve by crushing the dynamics in your music goes away because YouTube's just going to turn it down anyway. Spotify is just going to turn it down anyway. Spotify does have a setting that lets you turn this on and off, but most people leave it on because it's on by default. And so we might be actually seeing the end of the loudness war, hopefully. There's no particular reason to make your song louder than you as an artist want it to be, because it's not going to get anybody else's attention by making it louder. YouTube's just going to turn it down anyway. So it's not going to be louder than anyone else's. So do what's right for your music, in other words. If you really want to make your mix louder, you've got to make something that's going to make your listeners want to turn up their volume. That's the only way you can actually make a loud mix. So you just have to make good music. Easy, right?
Just want to give a heads up. Want to do 5 minutes left, so we just want.
Oh, I have to finish by 6? Oh.
Yeah, we also do want to let people get.
Oh, okay, all right. All right, in that case, let me just skip over to the demo then, okay?
Yeah.